Starting off this countdown, we have Dennis Rader. Dennis Rader is an American serial killer who killed 10 people between 1974 to 1991. Now, Dennis likes to go by the name BTK, or the BTK Strangler, which stands for Bind 'em, Torture 'em, Kill 'em. So that right there says a lot about him. In 2005, he was convicted for his crimes, and there's this very creepy video of him detailing his murders. Currently, he is in solitary confinement, which he will be until the day he dies. To this day, though, he is still considered one of the most diabolical serial killers in American history. In our 9th spot, we have Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was an infamous serial killer who was responsible for murdering 30 women, although it's thought that the number may have been higher. He would often kill these women in brutal ways. Now, one of the reasons why Bundy is on this list is because he managed to escape custody twice. The first time, he jumped out a second-story building and then fled. Eventually, he was caught, but then he escaped again. This time, he lost enough weight to squeeze through a hole in his cell's ceiling. Now, what's scary is that when he did escape, he went on to murder more women. As a result, he was considered a dangerous prison inmate that officers had to keep a close eye on. Moving on to number 8, we have the Eyeball Man. Maybe you've seen his picture, maybe you haven't. But once you have, I promise it will be ingrained in the back of your mind forever. Jason Barnum, otherwise known as the Eyeball Man, has a long list of crimes under his belt. He was sentenced to 22 years in jail after shooting a police officer. He is considered the Eyeball Man because, well, one of his eyeballs is tattooed completely black. On top of that, one side of his face is tattooed to look like a skull. So not only is this dude a dangerous criminal, but he looks like one too. In our 7th spot, we have Richard Lee Mcnair. Richard Lee Mcnair received 2 life sentences after being convicted of murder, attempted murder, and burglary. Now, the reason he is on this list is because he managed to escape prison 3 different times. The first time was in 1988 when he used lip balm to slide his handcuffs off. Then in 1992, he escaped again. And in 2006, he escaped for his last time by mailing himself out of prison. As a result, he was placed into Supermax prison. To this day, he is known as the master escapist. Making our way down the list at number 6, we have Roy Gardner. Roy Gardner was an American criminal. During the Roaring 20s, he managed to steal more than $350,000 in cash, but clearly he didn't get away with it. But Roy did manage to escape from custody multiple times. He was considered the most dangerous inmate in the history of the Atlanta prison. Newspapers all across the coast had articles written about him, often referring to him as the Smiling Bandit or the Mail Train Bandit or King of the Escape Artists. Due to escaping custody multiple times, he was transferred to Alcatraz. From there, he was considered one of the most notorious and ruthless inmates at Alcatraz. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with Robert Stroud. Robert Stroud, also known as the Birdman of Alcatraz, was the prison's most famous inmate. Stroud was imprisoned after violently killing a bartender. While in jail, he became a violent prisoner. He stabbed a prison guard, stabbed fellow prisoners, and would constantly get in fights with other inmates and staff. As a result, he was sentenced to an additional 6 months. He was considered very aggressive, violent, and cruel. Coming in at number 4, we have Barry Mills. Barry Mills was incarcerated at a very young age, and from there, he grew to be a brutal leader of a prison gang. This gang was huge across prisons. In fact, it resulted in numerous prison wars. It was said that he was admired by his inmates, but also highly feared by them. In fact, in 1979, he tried to decapitate an inmate in a bathroom stall in prison. In 2002, he was among 40 people charged with committing 32 murders or trying to. This gave him the name the Vengeful Killer. Again, this dude looks pretty terrifying. Like, he would always wear dark sunglasses because his eye got damaged in a prison fight. In our third spot, we have Charles Bronson. Charles Bronson was an English criminal who gained the title the most violent prisoner in Britain, or Britain's most notorious prisoner. He was first arrested for armed robbery and served a 7-year sentence. Upon his release, he had a career in bare-knuckle boxing. Then in 1988, he was convicted of conspiracy to commit another robbery. However, this time when he went back to jail, he became a more violent inmate. In fact, there were multiple times where he took inmates as hostages. A famous quote from Bronson reads, "I'm a nice guy, but sometimes I lose all my senses and become nasty." In our second spot, we have Thomas Edward Silverstein. If you Google who is the most dangerous inmate, this dude, Thomas Edward Silverstein, will pop up. Now, don't judge a book by its cover. At first I saw his image and I was like, there's no way that this dude is possibly scary. Boy, was I wrong. So, Silverstein was originally jailed for armed robbery, but while in prison, he committed numerous other crimes. First, he killed one of his officers, in which he stabbed multiple times. Then he murdered multiple other inmates. As a result, he had to be detained in a specially designed cell at the ADX Florence Federal Penitentiary in Colorado. Due to the crimes he committed while in jail, he is considered the most violent prisoner in America. And in our number one spot, we have Robert Maudsley. Robert Maudsley is considered Britain's most dangerous prisoner. In fact, he is so dangerous that he is kept locked up in a glass cell underneath Wakefield Jail. He spends 23 hours of his day in solitary confinement. Now, why is he so dangerous? Well, in 1977, Maudsley and his fellow inmates held another prisoner hostage. They tortured him for 9 hours before cracking his head open and killing him. It's rumored that he may have also eaten some of the prisoner's brain. As a result, he was deemed the real-life Hannibal Lecter. A couple months later, he murdered 2 other inmates. Then he casually told the prison officer that during the next roll call, he would be 2 prisoners short.
At number 10, we have Terry Nichols. Terry Nichols and Timothy McVeigh were responsible for the largest domestic terrorist attack in American history. The two parked a truck that was rigged with explosives, then drove it into a parking garage of a downtown building and detonated it. The explosion killed 168 people and injured 60 more. It was a massive explosion that shredded the 3-story building. The ripples of the explosion flew through the city, shattering windows of the nearby buildings, which led to even more injuries and over $600 million in damages. These guys were not messing around at all. This was a massive attack. It didn't take long for Nichols to get caught, and once they had him in custody, they were able to link him back to the crime with DNA evidence. The trial was short, and after everything was said and done, Nichols received 161 consecutive life sentences. So it's safe to say that he's going to die in jail. It's always cases like this that make me wonder how intelligent someone needs to be to pull off something like this, and what good they could have created if they chose to go down a different path with their life. So we have Thomas Silverstein. This guy has a rap sheet a mile long. He has been arrested for robbery, theft, vandalism, attempted murder, and of course, regular murder. The case that got him locked up for good was when he stabbed a man over 60 times. Since then, he's been bounced around to a few different prisons in America, and he's considered one of the most dangerous men in the American prison system. I would think once you're in prison, you would stop committing crimes, but not Silverstein. Some people don't want to stop once they're on a roll. Since this guy's been locked up, he's murdered 2 inmates and a guard. Now he's locked in solitary confinement, probably for good. If you can't play well with others, you don't get to hang out with the other kids. He's fighting back against his forced solitary lifestyle. He's filed a case against the Federal Bureau of Prisoners. He considers the conditions he's forced to live in torture. But dude, what do you expect? When you hang out with other people, you kill them. At number 8, we have Martin Bryant. If you're a viewer from Australia, you probably know exactly who this man is. He changed your country for good. good. Martin Bryant was the madman that performed the worst mass shooting that Australia has ever seen. After that, gun laws were permanently changed. It's super hard to get a gun in Australia. I think you're able to get one for like hunting or something, or do you guys still hunt with boomerangs over there? I'm just kidding. The shooting I'm talking about is of course the Port Arthur massacre, where Bryant shot and killed 35 people. On top of that, he kidnapped someone, stole a car, and injured 23 other people. This guy was on a rampage, and watching him talk about his mental space while he was doing this makes your skin crawl. For all his horrible crimes, he was sentenced to 1,035 years in prison. And as I mentioned before, Australia had a massive overhaul on all their gun laws. The country has like never been the same since then, well, when it comes to guns. At number 7, we have Dwight York. This man was a cult leader in New York City, a great place to find crazies to follow a cause. He made up his own belief system that he took from several other religions, and like most cult leaders, he wanted to make his own country. So far, this guy seems kinda harmless, until you learn that he was preaching hatred towards other ethnicities, and he also molested children. Like most cult leaders, this guy was a horrible person. Once he was caught, he was put on trial and admitted to everything, which made for a quick sentence. He was given 137 years in prison, so I think his religion is dead now. At number 6, we have Charles Scott Robinson. I'm going to do a brief breakdown of this man's crimes because they are very disturbing. If you want to know more about this grotesque man, you can obviously look him up, but I would suggest against that. Just take my word for it when I say he's a horrible person. Charles Scott Robinson was convicted of 6 counts of sexual assault against a 3-year-old girl in an Oklahoma courtroom. Every breakdown of his charges will make your stomach turn. It was one of the most open and shut cases ever in Oklahoma state history. It took the jury only 35 minutes to decide his fate. Now, they couldn't give him life in prison because of Oklahoma state law, but there was no way that the people there were going to let this monster think he was going to see the light of day again. So for each one of his 6 charges, the judge issued 5,000 years in prison. We'll see this guy running loose after the sun explodes. At number 5, we have Ivan Millet. If you ever seen the movie Wolf Creek, it's all about this man. He was given the name the Backpack Murderer because he would target backpackers out in the wilderness. The first time he was ever put on trial was back in 1971. This twisted psychopath raped 2 girls with a knife and was able to walk because they couldn't link the crimes back to him. After that, he went quiet, but in 1989, the burnt bodies of some foreign backpackers were discovered. They couldn't link the case to anyone, but for the next 4 years, 5 other people killed and burned in similar ways would pop up. Eventually, the police caught up with Millet. They pushed him to confess for his crimes, but he never let out a peep about what he did. After everything was said and done, he was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences in 1996. He's been serving his time in jail, but recently fell ill with stomach cancer and esophagus cancer. It seems that he was going to die very soon, and the police attempted once again to get him to admit to his crimes, just to give peace of mind to the victims and their families. But again, he refused. He died on October 27, 2019. I know this is a list of people living out their sentences, but this guy just died, and it was an interesting one, so I wanted to include it on the list. Also, the movie's alright. At number 4, we have Gary Ridgway. This man is one of the most famous American serial killers ever. He was active throughout the 80s and 90s in Washington, and it's thought that he was responsible for the deaths of up to 71 women. He would prey on women who were in struggling circumstances, mainly women involved in sex work or teenage girls who had run away from home. He would normally kill them through strangulation, sometimes using his hands, other times using a rope or a belt tied around their neck. After he killed his victims, he would dump their bodies in wooded areas. This is so he could come back and have sex with their dead bodies later. Some of his victims were also disposed of in the Green River, and that's how he got his nickname, the Green River Killer. 5 of the bodies were found in the Green River before he was caught, and the press coined that nickname for him before they had any idea of his identity. After he had been tried, he was sentenced to 41 consecutive life sentences and 480 years on top of that. He is now 70 years old and rotting in prison. At number 3, we have Rami Youssef. This man is a notorious terrorist who planned several attacks on America. He planned a terrorist attack against the World Trade Center back in 1993, where one of his underlings drove a truck filled with explosives into the base of the tower. This was a relatively small attack, only 6 people were killed, which is still terrible, but not as horrible when you learn that his uncle was behind the September 11th attacks. I guess terrorism runs problems in the family. After he was arrested, he was quickly tried and is now serving 2 consecutive life sentences. At number 2, we have Jamal Zuga. This man is one of the ringleaders behind the most savage terrorist attack that has ever hit Spain. Jamal, with the help of 2 other terrorists, managed to plant bombs in a subway car in Madrid. These exploded, killing 192 people and injuring several others. This shocked the entire nation, with a massive manhunt sent out to find out who was responsible. Eventually they tracked down the culprits, and after the trial, Jamal was sentenced to 42,922 years in prison. His 2 henchmen also received similar sentences to rack up the total years between all of them to be over 100,000 years in prison. Shouldn't they just say like forever? Like no more chances, do not pass go, do not collect $200, you're going away forever, dude. And for our number 1 spot, we have Ted Kaczynski. This is one of the most famous investigations in history. It has gone down as the most expensive case that the FBI has ever undergone. Ted Kaczynski was insane, but also a genius. He had a bachelor's from Harvard and a master's and a PhD from the University of Michigan. Before his life of crime, he was known for his incredible intellect and aptitude with mathematics. Due to his disdain for modern society, he abandoned city life and went to live as a recluse in the woods. This was back in 1969. He was teaching himself how to live off the land. Because of the continuous expansion of technology, he found the changing world impossible to ignore and decided to turn to a life of crime. In 1978, he began to send out packaged bombs to universities and airlines. He was active for nearly 2 decades, and in this time he killed 3 people and injured 23 others. From him continuously targeting universities and airlines, the FBI had him under the codename UA Bomb, as in University Airline Bomber, which the media then turned into the Unabomber. Eventually he sent out a manifesto to the New York Times demanding that they publish it or he would bomb another airline. They did publish Ted's manifesto, but this would be his undoing. His brother recognized his handwriting and gave his location to the FBI. Now he's serving 8 consecutive life sentences.
Starting off this list, and at number 10 we have Howard Christensen, who spent 64 years in prison. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. This was after he murdered a teacher back in 1937. He was only 16 years old at the time of the crime, and he didn't do it alone. A 17-year-old was his accomplice, but he couldn't handle facing prison time, so he hung himself in prison. But for Christensen, he outwaited his prison sentence for a chance to see freedom, and it actually happened for him. When he was 80 years old and 64 years later, his sentence was overturned and he was paroled. He passed away 2 years after being free at the age of 82 years old. Richard Honeck is up next at number 9 on our list. This is a man who has been to prison since he was 22 years old and spent the next 64 years and 44 days staring at prison bars. He was sentenced in 1899 for the murder of a former school friend. When Honeck was in prison, he was all over the media, and for some reason he became very famous. He received a mailbag of like 2,000 letters, including a proposal of marriage. There was even employment offers. Is this real life right now? What the heck is going on? This guy's getting employment offers? I mean, who wants to employ him? In prison, he was only allowed 1 letter per week, but luckily he was able to spend 64 years in prison. So I did the math a little bit here for you guys. That works up to 3,328 letters he was able to open during his time spent in prison. Maybe we should have given him more time to, give him more time to open up even more letters. Honeck was actually released from prison at the age of 84 years old, and he was able to live to the age of 97 years old. So that's 13 years of freedom. Number 8, we have Clarence Marshall, who is known as the person who served the longest time in prison in Michigan. He spent 64 years and 70 days in prison. He was sentenced to life in prison on 1 count of armed robbery and another of unarmed assault with intent to rob and steal. He was sentenced back in 1952. In 2012, there was a public hearing to consider his parole. Well, 3 years after that hearing, he was released from prison and he was granted parole in 2015. Marshall was 84 years old when he became a free man. William Herons, the man known as the Lipstick Killer, well, he is the longest serving prisoner in Chicago. He served 65 years and 181 days in prison before he passed away in prison. Well, he comes in on our list at number 7. William George Herons was an American convicted serial killer who confessed to 3 murders in 1946. He was called the Lipstick Killer because he would always write a message at the crime scene with a lipstick. Years after the confession, he tried to take back his statement, saying that he was a victim of coerced interrogation and police brutality.
This was a confession story, and there wasn't any confession story. They made it up. Later on, they admitted that they did. but that didn't help me.
He was given a life sentence with the possibility of parole, but he died in prison at the age of 83 years old. He passed away from diabetes. One of the youngest people to be convicted and sentenced on our list is next up at number 6. We have Joseph Ligon, who is still in prison for a crime he committed at the age of 15 years old, which always sparked the debate of how young can a person be before they're allowed to be given an adult sentence of like life in prison. Ligon was 15 years old and he's still in prison almost 66 years later. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for a murder. But it took a US Supreme Court 66 years to declare that life without the possibility of parole, well, it was classified as unconstitutional for juvenile murderers, so he was released. Number 5, we have a man who served 66 years and 123 days. We're talking about Johnson Van Dyke Grisby. He was sentenced to life in prison after he killed a man in a bar fight. Grisby was actually able to outlive his prison sentence, and he was released at the age of 89 years old. For some reason, he returned back to prison and he volunteered there. He volunteered for the hard jobs in prison. Grisby was convicted of second-degree murder in 1908, and he was eventually paroled from Indiana State Penitentiary in Michigan City in 1974, which means he served out just over 66 years. He was 89 years old when he saw freedom. When he was released, he was able to live another 12 years before he passed away at the age of 101 years old. We have John Phillips at number 4. Phillips' prison sentence is still ongoing, but as of right now, at the time of this recording, Phillips just passed his 67th year in prison. He is known to be the longest serving prisoner in North Carolina. Phillips was convicted when he was just in the 9th grade, and he was arrested and charged with sexual assault that landed him in prison for a very long time. He took a plea deal to avoid the death penalty, and he received life in prison. Now at the age of 85 years old, he has lost all desire to live in the real world. A lot of these convicts, when they leave prison, they're just given like 20 bucks and a bus ticket to get to where they want to go. But how do you know where you want to go? You've been locked away for almost 70 years. So many changes in that time. If Phillips did leave prison, it would almost be a death sentence to him, because how would he even survive? You lose so much contact with the outside world, it leaves you confused and leaves you foreign in your own country. Also, Phillips is almost 90 years old with no pension, no money coming in. How would he work? So staying in prison is just the best situation for him. He gets food, he always has a shelter, and he always has, something to do. Moving into number 3, we have talked about this man before on this channel. We've talked about him many times, not for good reasons. We're talking about Paul Giddle Jr., who served out 68 years and 245 days, so almost 69 years in prison. We talked about him before because he's actually known to be the longest serving inmate who was able to outlive his prison sentence. Giddle Jr. was only 17 years old when he went to prison. He was convicted of second-degree murder in 1911. Giddle Jr. was actually released early for good behavior, so he was granted parole in 1974, and that was when he was 80 years old. He has absolutely no family members or people that he knows because he grew up in an orphanage, and he chose to remain in prison for 6 more years. So he was actually released earlier. But he was finally forced to leave the prison, and he was placed in a nursing home at the age of 86 years old, and he was able to live out his days until the age of 93. At number 2, we have Francis Clifford Smith, who is currently still in prison. He is known right now as the longest serving inmate who is still alive, and he is still serving prison time. Right now, at the time of this recording, he's at 69 years and about 50 days. He's coming closer and closer to that 70-year mark. Right now, Smith is known to be the oldest prisoner in the United States. He was actually sentenced to death for a murder. He murdered a night watchman during a robbery at a yacht club. He was incarcerated back in 1950. Just 2 hours before his scheduled execution, something happened. His sentence was overturned from the death penalty, and it was changed to life in prison. So now he has a chance of becoming the person who has served the longest amount of time in prison. I'm not sure if you really want to be known for that. This man was born in 1924, making him currently 94 years old. Do you guys think he's too old now to like be harmful to society? Should we let him out of prison? Also, even though this man is known to be the oldest living person to have served the most amount of time in prison, not much public information exists about this guy. All I really know is that he was 24 years old when he was sentenced, and in 1967, which is the same year the Toronto Maple Leafs won their last cup, well, he was able to escape prison for 11 days. Finally, number 1, we have the only person on this list to have served over 70 years behind bars. That is a very long time. We're talking about Charles Fossard, who spent 70 years and 303 days in a prison in Australia. Fossard was a French-Australian homeless man who murdered an elderly man for his boots. Clearly, this man was insane, so he was quickly sent to the J Ward Mental Asylum in Victoria, Australia, and he was left there for the next 7 decades. Fossard was admitted to the prison in 1903 at the age of 21 years old, and he wasn't able to outlive his prison sentence. He actually passed away while in prison in 1974 at the age of 92 years old. He is known as the longest serving patient at the facility and the longest serving convict on this list. A record for sure you don't want to have, and Francis Clifford Smith, who I just talked about, has a real shot at breaking this record. So I don't know how he feels about that, or if he even knows that he's so close to breaking the record. And if he's released early, does he make a decision on like staying in prison a little bit longer? Because at least he did something in life. I don't know. Starting us off like we always do, at number 10, we're talking about Faisal Shahzad. He was arrested for the May 1st, 2010 Times Square car bombing. He was arrested when 2 street vendors discovered a car bomb that had been planted under a Nissan Pathfinder. He admitted that he did the bomb making training at a camp run by a militant Islamic group back in Pakistan. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for the conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction and attempting an act of terrorism. Zacarias Moussaoui makes it onto this list at number 9. He is infamously known for his involvement with the September 11th attack. He pleaded guilty in the US federal court to conspiring to kill citizens of the United States as a part of the 9/11 attack. He is currently serving 6 life sentences without the chance of parole in Colorado after he was sentenced to life imprisonment instead of the death penalty. He said, "America, you lost, I won." The judge replied and said, "You will die," with a whimper and never get a chance to speak again. And up next, number 8, is Aryan Brotherhood. This is a group of white supremacist and neo-Nazi prison gang in the United States that has more than 15,000 to 20,000 members, both in and out of the prison system. The Aryan brothers are responsible for 30% of prison murders, drug trafficking, extortion, and inmate prostitution. One of the highest ranking members is Thomas Silverstein, and he is responsible for 4 murders that took place in prison. He has actually been held in solitary confinement since 1983. The Numbers Gang fight their way into number 7. This dangerous gang was established in 1911, and they control most of South African prisons. They are actually the most feared prison gang in all of South Africa. Any prisoner who betrayed the gang is not safe. They will hold a trial, and they are deemed guilty. That prisoner will die of strangulation or his throat will be slit. They are notorious for their brutal attacks on guards and wardens as well. Now at number 6, we have Michael Swango. He is an infamous American serial killer. He used to be a doctor. It is believed that he was involved in 60 murders but only admitted to causing 4 deaths. He was sentenced in 2000 to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. While he was working as a doctor, the nurses noticed that healthy patients would later become strangely ill under his care. Apparently he is linked to numerous other deaths in multiple hospitals over a course of 20 years. Dwight York makes its way into number 5. He is the founder of the United Nubian National Cult, where he had very tight control over his followers. He exercised strict sexual practices within his cult, reserving himself for sexual access to many women and girls, including wives and children of followers. In 2002, he was arrested and charged with more than 100 counts of sexually molesting dozens of children, some as young as 4 years old. He is currently serving a 135-year sentence. Moving into number 4 is Barry Mills. He is the leader of the Aryan Brotherhood prison gang. He was the first arrested in 1967 for an armed robbery, and now he has been in and out of prison ever since. He has ordered the murder of dozens of people inside of maximum security prison. Back in 1979, he was responsible responsible for decapitating another inmate, and he is involved in a bunch of other crimes such as drug trafficking, conspiracy, and racketeering. Terry Nichols comes into this list at number 3. He was convicted of organizing the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. On April 19th, 1995, Terry Nichols and another man killed 168 people with an explosive bomb that also damaged 324 buildings, destroying 86 cars and shattering glass in 258 nearby buildings. He was sentenced to 161 consecutive life-term sentences, and that's without the possibility of parole. Number 2 brings us to Ramzi Youssef. He was one of the main perpetrators behind the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center. Ramzi Youssef and 6 other men planted a truck bomb below the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. The nitrate hydrogen bomb was intended to send the North Tower crashing into the South Tower, but even though it failed, 6 people were killed and thousands were injured. He is currently serving a life sentence. And finally, in at number 1 is Pedro Rodrigues. He is known as Brazil's most dangerous prisoner and serial killer. His father had beaten Pedro's mother so violently while she was pregnant with him that he was born with an injured skull. At 14 years old, he killed 2 men, and by the time he was 18, he had murdered 10 people and tortured even more. He later went on to kill his own father and remove his father's heart, and he chewed on it. I mean, is this real life right now? He was arrested in 1973, and he has admitted to killing over 47 inmates since his arrest.
Starting off at number 10 now, we have Peter Sutcliffe. He's probably one of the UK's most notorious serial killers, known in the press as the Yorkshire Ripper. In 1981, he was convicted of murdering 13 women and attempting to murder a further 7 more across the English county of Yorkshire. Many of his victims were prostitutes. Now, he claimed that the voice of God had sent him on a mission to kill them. At his trial, he pleaded not guilty on the grounds of diminished responsibility due to his paranoid schizophrenia. That defense was wholly rejected by the jury, and he is currently serving 20 life sentences in prison. Next up at number 9 now, we have Thomas Silverstein. He's sometimes referred to as the most dangerous man in America. Now, he's been in prison since 1977 and was famously once a leader of the Aryan Brotherhood, a white supremacist prison gang. Since being in prison, he has been convicted of the murder of 4 other inmates. He once stabbed an inmate 67 times. He has been in solitary confinement since 1983 after killing a prison guard. That means he is totally alone for 23 hours of the day with no human contact. Alright, moving on to number 8 now, we have Zacarias Moussaoui. This man is commonly known as the 20th hijacker of 9/11, the other 19 all dying in the attacks. So, how is he alive? Well, he was actually arrested for an immigration violation just weeks before the attack was meant to happen, and so he couldn't participate. In the investigation following the attack, the FBI linked him to the 9/11 plot. He pled guilty in a US federal court to conspiring to kill citizens of the US as part of the September 11th attacks. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. As he left the courtroom, he clapped his hands and said, "America, you lost, I won." He clearly shows no remorse for his involvement and is still regarded as very dangerous. Next up at number 7 now, we have Terry Nichols. Along with Timothy McVeigh, Nichols was responsible for the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, which killed 168 people. He was sentenced to 161 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. That actually set a Guinness World Record. He is currently incarcerated at ADX Florence, a super maximum security prison in Colorado designed to hold the most dangerous American criminals. One government official said that place is designed for prisoners who show absolutely no concern for human life. Moving on to number 6 now, we have Dwight York. This man was the leader of the New Albion cult based in New York. It was based around pseudo-Islamic and Jewish beliefs and later incorporated elements of ancient Egyptian culture, UFOs, and conspiracy theories. He built a very loyal community around him that helped and protected him while he molested countless children. He admitted to all of these charges freely in court. He may have been able to avoid detection even further were it not for a huge Egyptian city that he had started building for his followers in Georgia. He is serving 135 years in solitary confinement. Next up at number 5 now, we have Ted Kaczynski. He is also known as the Unabomber. From 1978 to 1995, he mailed 16 bombs to universities and facilities across the US, killing 3 people and injuring a further 23. In 1995, he wrote a 35,000-word manifesto explaining his issues with the direction America was heading in. He sent it to the Washington Post, then blackmailed them into publishing it, saying he would send a bomb to an unspecified location if they didn't print it. The FBI really struggled to track him down. At one point he was on their top 10 most wanted list. He was apprehended because his own brother suspected that he was the Unabomber. He's serving a life sentence at ADX Florence. Next up at number 4 now, we have Ivan Milat. This Australian convict is also known as the Backpack Killer for his serial killings between 1989 and 1993. He killed 7 young backpackers in the forests of New South Wales in Australia, stabbing them multiple times and even using one of them for target practice to shoot at. His crimes inspired other copycat murders, as well as the movie Wolf Creek. At the number 3 spot now, we have Michael Swango. Also known as Dr. Death, this former doctor turned serial killer is thought to be responsible for up to 60 fatal poisonings of patients and colleagues. He would poison his co-workers with arsenic, sipping it into their food and drink when they weren't looking. With his patients, he would often administer and overdose whatever drug they had been prescribed. At his trial, the prosecution read out pages from his notebook where Swango would describe the joy he felt during his crimes. He is currently serving 3 consecutive life terms at the ADX Florence prison, which we've mentioned earlier on in the video. Alright, moving on to number 2 now, we have Ramzi Youssef. This is the mastermind behind the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, an attack 8 years prior to 9/11. He detonated a 1,000-pound car bomb in the garage below the World Trade Center, killing 6 people and injuring over 1,000 more. In court, he said, "Yes, I am a terrorist and proud of it." He didn't receive the death penalty because it didn't become legal for his crime until a year after that crime happened. Instead, he is now serving 240 years in prison, a total of the life expectancies of the people killed in the attack. And finally, at number 1 now, we have Charles Edmund Cullen. This former nurse is suspected to be the most prolific serial killer in American history. Now, he has confessed to killing up to 40 of his patients over his 16-year career through overdoses and medical contamination. When investigators began to interview him though, they realized he may have killed a lot more people. Some experts estimate up to 400. He told police that he killed them to end their suffering, but other staff at the hospital described the patients as recovering well. He is currently serving 127 years in prison and still seems very unaware of the suffering and damage he's caused.
At number 10, we're talking about Albert Flick, who spent decades of his life in prison for brutally murdering his wife. But as it turns out, he was released because people thought that he was too old to pose a threat to society. And as you probably guessed it, they were wrong. He was released in 2004, but just 6 years later, 2010, he was convicted again for a similar crime. He stabbed a woman 11 times in broad daylight while her twin sons watched. Apparently he was obsessed with this woman and found out that she was planning on leaving town, so he thought, if I can't have her, no one will. He went to the nearest Walmart, bought the sharpest knives he can find, and killed her right in public. He did not care. I guess the judge presiding on the original case is probably regretting his decision right about now. A serial killer released from prison early comes in at number 9. Louis Van Schoor is an ex-policeman and a security guard who shot dead 39 people that he claimed were burglars. So after each murder, he was cleared by officials because they said that he acted within the law. However, the truth was finally discovered in 1992, and he was convicted of 7 murders and 2 assassinations, even though he told a reporter that he killed more than 100 people. Is this real life right now? He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but he only served 12 years before being released into public. I cannot believe this story. His family is actually pretty messed up too. His daughter was arrested because she hired a hitman to kill her mother back in 2002. I guess it's true what they say. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. A kidnapper now walks free, and this takes us to number 8. Charlene Galico killed people with the help of her sick partner, but once the police captured them, she turned on her partner and testified against him in return for a lesser sentence. Though both of them kidnapped several young women and forced them into sex slavery before murdering them. Well, get this, they managed to kill 10 people before being arrested in 1980, but what's even crazier about this whole thing is she managed to only serve 16 years in prison before she was released. And now she is in her 60s living, a normal life outside of prison. This whole story just sounds absolutely insane to me. I think she should have spent the rest of her life rotting behind bars, but that's just my opinion. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. How do you kill 10 people and serve just 16 years? That's under 2 years per person. We have the escape artist. Nikita Fogenstein is a Swedish serial killer who could be lurking outside of your house right now. Go check. Okay, not really, but maybe. He killed killed 3 people in 1988 and he received a life sentence for his crimes. His prison sentence was short-lived when he escaped from prison in 1994. During his freedom, he held a teacher hostage but was recaptured by police. Afterwards, he somehow managed to escape prison not once, not twice, but 3 times. Okay, seriously, what prison was he being held at? Because it sounds like they don't have, you know, metal bars or cells. I mean, it sounds pretty escapable. Anyways, in 2011, he managed to escape again, but this time, he has not been caught. So this serial killer is just out there on the loose and no one has any idea where he might be. So yeah, maybe I'm not joking. I would for sure lock your doors right now. A Canadian serial killer brings us to number 6. Karla Homolka and her psychotic husband assaulted and murdered multiple women, including her very own sister. They were arrested in 1993, where her husband received life in prison, but she was able to strike up a plea bargain. She told investigators that she was an unwilling accomplice to the murders and she was forced to do it. She agreed to plead guilty in exchange for a 12-year prison sentence of manslaughter. The deal went through, but later on, videotapes of the crime surfaced and they showed that she was more of an active participant that she had claimed. But it was too late. She was released from prison in 2005 and now this convicted serial killer and rapist is living in Canada as a free woman with her kids, and get this, she even volunteers at their school where she supervises their class field trips. I mean, do people know about her? Next up on our list, and at number 5, we have a cannibalistic killer. I know what you guys must be thinking. How the heck did we manage to release a convicted cannibal serial killer back into society? Well, to be honest with you guys, I have no idea. I mean, what compelled us to do that? Esai Sagawa shot a woman to death and then decided to eat her meat because he believed that it would bring him extra strength. You know what? I hear chicken and pork do the same thing. You don't need to go killing people for protein. As soon as he was arrested, he was transferred to a mental hospital, but he was released just 5 years later because they declared him sane. I'm pretty sure he is the opposite of sane. I think we should add an in front of sane and call him insane. But anyway, since his release, he has become a celebrity in Japan and he has lots of fans who admire him. Do I sense a potential cannibalistic cult forming here? I don't know. And what if he starts craving human meat again? What do we do with him? Next up, number 4, we're talking about a serial killer nurse. I know this sounds weird to say because aren't nurses supposed to be compassionate people who are there to, you know, try to keep you alive, try to heal you? Well, I don't know what school Arfin and Neset went to because he definitely didn't get that memo. Neset confessed to murdering 27 of his patients, but others believe that he could have killed over 100 people. He poisoned most of them and was given a 21-year sentence because apparently that's the maximum prison term in Norway. I mean, that is absolutely insane. So he's now a free man living under a new identity, so no one knows who he is. If Norway has such a short maximum prison sentence, what other sadistic criminals are freely released? Doesn't anyone see a problem with this? Wouldn't this attract serial killers to your country? The child killer brings us to number 3. In 1968, Mary Bell was 11 years old when she was found guilty of murdering 2 young boys aged 3 and 4 years old. These murders are pretty horrific and I wouldn't go into all of the details because it will literally make you feel sick to your stomach. Unfortunately, I had to read through it. All you need to know is that she was a very sick and twisted 11-year-old who should have been kept a long time in prison. She was convicted in December 1968 of manslaughter, but she was released 12 years later. Yeah, that's right, just 12 years later. And as a condition of her release, she was given a new name and a court order to forbid anyone from exposing her identity. What happens if you do? Would you go to jail, and would your jail sentence be longer than someone who murdered someone? So no one knows where she is today or what she's been doing since her release. Is it just me, or is there something chilling about a freed serial killer under a new identity? She could literally be anywhere at any time. Sorry, I thought I might have saw something. One of the scariest serial killers makes it onto our list at number 2. We have Pedro Lopez, who has a ton of blood on his hands. He is responsible for murdering hundreds of women across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. He was sentenced for killing 110 little girls, but he actually confessed to killing more than 300 girls across South America. Police arrested him in 1980, but Lopez managed to only spend 14 years in prison. I mean, is this real life right now? I have to say it again. He was released and transferred to a mental hospital where he spent only 3 years there. Somehow he was declared sane in 1998 and he was released on a $50 bail. Currently Lopez is free and it's suspected that he's been involved in a bunch of other murders, assaults since his release, and his whereabouts, we know how this story ends. His whereabouts is unknown. We don't know where this guy is. Metal Fang tops our list in at number 1. I mean, how do you beat that last guy? Nikolai, I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce his last name. Well, he is a cannibal killer who murdered and ate the remains of at least 7 women. Although this number could be as high as 50, he was given the nickname Metal Fang, and that's because he replaced his own teeth with white wire metal teeth. Thankfully, he was caught in 1980, but he somehow managed to escape prison in 1989, just 9 years after. He probably used his metal teeth to, chew his way through the bars, probably a first ever. Eventually he was recaptured, but he was released from prison 10 years later because of his psychological evaluation. I'm not an expert here, but I'm pretty sure a guy who ripped out all of his teeth and ate human flesh isn't the most stable guy. This is a guy I wouldn't hire. I think he should stay behind bars and be served a vegan diet, but as it turns out, he is out in public, probably buying some seasoning and spices for his next victim. I mean meal, for his next meal.